On a freezing winter morning, a detective and her battle-scarred K9 uncover evidence that revives a cold case, two sisters missing for 4 years. But the truth is darker than anyone imagined. The girls are alive, raised underground by a man they call Papa Paul. When finally confronted, they must decide between him and the mother they no longer remember. The ending will leave you in tears. If you want more emotional stories like this, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from in the comments. The December wind swept through the small town of Redfield with a merciless sharpness, the kind that found its way through coats and scarves and pressed against skin until it reached bone. Detective Grace Miller adjusted her scarf and flexed her gloved fingers around Max's leash. The German shepherd trotted ahead with the energy of a soldier still on duty, his paws crunching against the icy ground, his nose constantly working as though the night itself were whispering something only he could hear. At the end of Birchwood Street, the abandoned house stood like a scar on the neighborhood. Its windows were boarded, its roof sagged with years of neglect, and ivy had crept across its weathered siding, black against the frost. To most people, it was nothing more than an eyesore, the kind of place teenagers dared each other to enter on Halloween. To Grace, it had always been a presence she could not ignore. Each time she and Max passed this way, he would hesitate, bristle, sometimes even growl low in his throat, as though the house carried a scent invisible to her. Tonight, however, was different. His pull on the leash was insistent. His body tense. His amber eyes focused on the house with a certainty that left no room for doubt. Grace had spent 30 years reading crime scenes, suspects, and hunches, and she had learned one thing with absolute conviction: a good dog never lies. She let him lead. The porch creaked under their weight, each step loud in the winter stillness. The door resisted only slightly before yielding with a moan that echoed through the hollow shell of the house. The smell of mildew, damp plaster, and old wood pressed against her face. Her flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across graffiti, broken furniture, and shattered glass scattered across the floor like forgotten stars. Max moved with urgency, nose to the ground, tail rigid. He circled once, twice, then darted toward the far corner, where the plaster had crumbled, exposing rough foundation stone. Grace crouched, her knees protesting, and watched as Max began to dig. Dust and fragments of mortar flew up around him. His claws scraped against the ground in a rhythm that grew more frantic by the second. Grace's pulse quickened. Dogs didn't dig without reason. She lowered her light, watching the debris scatter, until Max stopped abruptly, his body stiff. He nosed into the dirt, whining softly. Grace reached forward, brushing aside the loose earth with her gloved hand. Her breath caught when fabric emerged from the shadows of dust and stone. She pulled carefully until the object came free. A child's shoe, small, pink once, though time had dulled its brightness to a muted rose. The stitching was frayed, the sole worn but intact, the kind of shoe that had been loved, used, and carried across playgrounds and sidewalks. Grace's hand trembled as she lifted it. This wasn't trash left by squatters. It wasn't a random relic of the past. It was something far heavier. Her throat tightened. She had seen countless objects marked as evidence in her career, but this one struck differently. She didn't need the file in her office or the faded photographs to recognize what she held. It had been 4 years, but she remembered every detail of the Carter twins' disappearance. The red coats against falling snow, the half-built snowman in the yard, the mother's screams splitting the night when she realized the gate was open and her daughters were gone. That Christmas Eve had changed the town forever. For most people, the memory had softened, dulled by time, replaced by new worries and new seasons. But for Grace, it had never ended. She had carried it in her bones every day since, a reminder of her own failure, of the silence that followed when the search turned up nothing. Now, staring at the small shoe in her hand, her heart pounded with a mixture of dread and vindication. She slipped it into an evidence bag with care, her hands steady though her chest was tight with emotion. "Good boy," she whispered to Max, who pressed his nose against her arm, his body still humming with restless energy. "You've found something important." She rose slowly, scanning the room again with her light. Every shadow felt different now. Every mark on the wall, every creak of wood under her boots. This wasn't just an abandoned house. It was a place that had been chosen, hidden, used. The thought lodged itself in her chest, like a splinter. Outside, the street was silent, the glow of porch lights warm against the frost. Ordinary lives went on only a few houses away. Families gathered around televisions, children tucked into bed, people unaware of the secrets unearthed just steps from their doors. Grace stepped out into the cold air, the evidence bag heavy in her coat pocket. She knew what she should do: call the sheriff, file the report, log the evidence, follow procedure. But she also knew what this meant. 4 years of silence had just cracked open. The case she could never let go of, the one that had defined her failures, had just stirred to life. She glanced down at Max. His ears were still forward, his body alert, his nose twitching as though waiting for her to understand the full weight of what he had uncovered. Grace tightened her grip on the leash. Her breath rose in small, steady clouds against the night sky. "We're not done here," she murmured. And for the first time in years, her heart carried not just grief, but purpose. The small shoe sat inside the evidence bag on the passenger seat, its faded pink fabric carrying the weight of years of silence. Detective Grace Miller rested her hands on the steering wheel, her gaze fixed on it as though staring hard enough might force it to speak. The patrol car's heater groaned against the Minnesota cold, filling the cabin with a low hum that seemed too steady, too normal, against the storm turning inside her. Max shifted in the back seat, his body tense, his eyes following her every move in the rearview mirror. Grace breathed out slowly, her chest heavy. She had been here before, too many times sitting alone in her car with the ghosts of other people's children pressing against her conscience. But tonight was different. Tonight it wasn't just about a case. Tonight it was about Emily. Her daughter's face rose in her mind unbidden, sharp as glass even after all these years. 16 years old, hair tied up in a messy bun, blue eyes bright with curiosity, her laughter spilling down the staircase on summer mornings. Emily had loved the stars, had taped glow-in-the-dark constellations to her ceiling, had insisted on staying up late to watch meteor showers. Grace had sat with her on the porch, wrapped in blankets, the girl's head against her shoulder as they whispered wishes into the night sky. Those memories were soft, fragile, but what came after was hard and raw. The coughing that wouldn't stop, the sterile smell of hospital corridors, the quiet doctors who avoided her eyes when they spoke, Emily's body shrinking under white sheets, her journals abandoned mid-sentence. Grace had spent her career catching criminals, reading evidence, tracing patterns, but she hadn't been able to stop what happened to her daughter. Cancer had been the thief she couldn't outsmart. It had left her with an empty house, a bedroom frozen in time, and rituals she couldn't let go of. Every morning, she poured 2 cups of coffee out of habit, placing one by the window where Emily used to sit. Every night she paused outside the girl's door, her hand resting on the knob, unable to open it, yet unable to walk away. Grief had rewired her, made her hyper-aware of the absence of children's voices, the quiet where laughter should be. That was why she couldn't let go of the Carter twins' case. Every time she saw Beth Carter's hollow eyes or heard the strain in her voice, she felt it in her own chest. It wasn't sympathy, it was recognition. Beth had been living the same nightmare Grace lived every day, only worse, because she didn't even have the cold comfort of knowing what had happened. She still clung to hope, the cruelest kind of anchor. Grace thought about Beth often, about how the young mother used to call every week, sitting across from her in the station, her hands twisting in her lap as she asked if there was any news. Each time Grace had to say no, she felt the words cut into both of them. Eventually the calls stopped. The visits stopped. Beth went back to her life, or what was left of it, but Grace knew she hadn't moved on. No one did. You learned to carry the weight, that was all. Grace rubbed at her eyes, her throat tight. The shoe in the evidence bag wasn't just proof of a crime. It was a reminder that someone else's Emily might still be out there, waiting. She couldn't let this go, no matter what the sheriff said. A soft sound pulled her from her thoughts. Max had shifted again, his nose pressed against the glass, his ears twitching. His amber eyes met hers in the mirror, steady, grounding. Grace turned slightly, her lips softening despite herself. Max wasn't just a partner. He was a survivor, too. She had read his file the first day they met. Afghanistan, an IED, his handler gone in an instant. Max had been pulled from the rubble with a limp and a hollow stare. The military had wanted to retire him, but something in him resisted, just like her. When she first looked into his eyes, she had seen it the same emptiness she saw in her own reflection each morning. They had been paired more out of convenience than strategy, but over time it had become something deeper. They were both broken, both stubborn, both unwilling to stop searching even when the world told them to give up. Max had his own rituals. Every evening he sat at the window of Grace's farmhouse, facing east, and let out a long, low howl. It wasn't loud, not the kind meant to disturb. It was mournful, almost reverent, as though calling across the miles to someone who would never answer. Grace never stopped him. She understood. It was the same reason she still set 2 plates at the dinner table sometimes, still kept Emily's belongings untouched. Both of them were clinging to ghosts, both unwilling to let silence erase memory. That was what bound them. Max wasn't just sharp in the field, wasn't just reliable in his instincts. He mirrored her persistence, her refusal to let go of a trail no matter how cold. Tonight, he had proved it again. He had led her to the shoe, had dug it out of years of dust and denial. She glanced at the evidence bag again. The small shoe glowing faintly under the dash light. Her hand itched toward her phone. She should call Bradley. She should log it, follow procedure. Prepare for the fight that would come when the sheriff told her to drop it. But her thumb hovered and didn't press. Because this wasn't just about procedure anymore. It was about Emily. It was about Beth. It was about the ache she carried, and the ache she couldn't let another mother carry alone. The heater hummed on. The night pressed close outside. Max shifted forward, resting his head on the console between the seats, his warm breath fogging the edge of the windshield. Grace stroked the fur between his ears, her hand steady now. The world might think they were just an old detective and her dog, but she knew better. They were 2 survivors, bound by grief and loyalty, standing on the edge of something neither of them could yet name. The evidence bag still sat on the passenger seat, the little shoe like a pulse under the harsh glow of the dashboard light, and Grace Miller drove in silence, her hands tight on the wheel. The road unspooled in front of her, dark and glittering with frost, the kind of quiet Minnesota night when even the stars seemed reluctant to watch. Max lay curled in the back seat, his breathing slow and steady, but his ears flicked every time the car hit a bump. Grace should have felt relief at finding something after so many years of dead ends. But instead the discovery pressed down on her chest like a weight she couldn't shift. The shoe was not just an object, it was a doorway back into the coldest part of her past. 4 years ago, 2 little girls had disappeared on Christmas Eve. Twin sisters named Lily and Laura Bennett. They were 5, identical in every way except the tilt of their smiles. Their disappearance had broken the town in half. Search parties had scoured the woods, the riverbanks, the abandoned lots on the edge of town. Helicopters had flown over snow-dusted fields, while neighbors locked their doors and whispered prayers. Grace had been there from the first night, standing in the Bennett family's small yard, while the snow fell thick and silent, covering whatever traces might have told the story. She had watched the twins' mother collapse in the driveway, her sobs muffled by gloved hands, and she had promised herself she would not rest until she found them. But the trail had gone cold almost instantly. No footprints beyond the gate, no strangers reported in town, no ransom note, no clue to hold on to. The case had consumed her, had lived in her every waking thought, had followed her into her dreams until sleep felt like another form of interrogation. And yet nothing. Days turned into weeks, then into months. Hope dried up, replaced by suspicion, theories, rumors. People whispered about the mother, about strangers passing through, about old feuds and buried secrets. Each lead dissolved into smoke. By the following Christmas, the town had stopped tying yellow ribbons to trees, had stopped organizing vigils. By the second year, people barely mentioned the twins' names except in hushed tones at church or in line at the grocery store. By the third year, the Bennett case had become another sad story folded into the town's history, the kind of thing people shook their heads about before moving on to weather talk. Everyone but Grace. She had never stopped circling back to that yard, that night, those vanished girls. Every time she passed the church ruins, she thought of Max's unease, his refusal to settle near the foundation, his restless pull eastward, as if something in his bones knew what her mind could not prove. She kept the Bennett file on her desk even when the sheriff told her to put it away, even when her colleagues rolled their eyes. Some cases branded themselves into your skin, refusing to fade no matter how much time passed. For Grace, the Bennett twins were that case. And now? 4 years later? This shoe. Her pulse quickened just thinking about it. The knitted pattern on the fabric matched the description the twins' grandmother had given in her tearful interview years ago. Grace had written it down in her notes, the detail standing out like a thread that refused to unravel into anything useful. A handmade pair, she'd said. A birthday gift. Blue for Laura. Pink for Lily. Grace remembered the grandmother's voice shaking, remembered her saying she had knitted them hoping the girls would wear them through winter, keep their feet warm when money was tight. And now here it was, pink and undeniable, pulled out of the earth by Max's relentless digging. Grace gripped the wheel tighter, the memory almost too sharp to bear. For 4 years, she had carried the suspicion that something had been missed, something buried just out of reach. Everyone else had learned to forget, to tuck the twins into the drawer of unsolved tragedies, but not her. Her instincts had screamed against the silence. Now this mitten proved she had been right all along. Her chest swelled with something between vindication and dread. Vindication because she had not been chasing shadows. Dread because if the mitten was here, then so were answers, and answers were never gentle. She slowed the car as she passed the church ruins, the black shape of the crumbling foundation rising against the snow like broken teeth. The place had always unsettled her, but tonight it felt like it was breathing, like it was holding its secrets tight against the frozen ground. She thought about the reverend who had once presided over it, about his watchful eyes and the way he always seemed to appear at the edge of every search, offering prayers and warm drinks. She had wanted to believe his kindness, but something about his timing had scratched at her instincts. She had written his name in the margins of her notebook once, circled it twice, then crossed it out when no evidence appeared. And yet here she was again, circling back. Max stirred in the back seat, his head lifting, his gaze pulling toward the foundation as if even half asleep he knew. Grace pulled the car to the side of the road and sat in the dark, the engine idling low. Snowflakes drifted across the windshield, catching the glow of her headlights before vanishing into the night. She closed her eyes, the weight of the past pressing hard. The girls' faces came back to her, framed in their winter coats, their laughter caught in the still air of memory. She whispered their names, Lily and Laura, like a prayer, like a vow. And when she opened her eyes again, the shoe sat there on the seat beside her, proof that ghosts had been waiting for her to return. Grace Miller sat in her car longer than she should have, the cold pressing in from every angle while the little shoe remained on the seat beside her, glowing like a wound. She couldn't shake the image of Lily and Laura Bennett, couldn't stop hearing their mother's cries on that frozen Christmas Eve, and couldn't stop thinking about the old church ruins that Max had refused to ignore. The connection was too sharp now, too obvious to dismiss. When the case had first broken years ago, one of the first people to appear at the scene had been Reverend Paul Turner. He was in his 70s then, silver hair combed neatly back, a tall man with kind eyes and a soft voice that carried authority born not from force, but from years of comforting the grieving. Grace remembered him stepping onto the Bennett's porch that night, carrying a thermos of hot chocolate and speaking gentle words to a mother who had just lost her world. He had walked among the volunteers, patting shoulders, murmuring prayers, reminding everyone that faith endured even when answers did not. People clung to him because he was steady when everything else was chaos. Grace had clung too, if she was honest. She had wanted to believe in his calm certainty, wanted to trust that someone with his reputation for goodness could anchor them in a storm that refused to settle. He had been part of the search every day in those first weeks, arriving early, staying late, offering his truck, his time, his presence. Nobody questioned him. Why would they? He was Reverend Turner, a man who had baptized half the town's children, buried its fathers, married its couples, a figure who had carried Millbrook Falls through grief before. But memory had sharp edges when viewed from years away. Grace now found herself replaying small details that hadn't mattered then. The Reverend's insistence on searching near the church ruins when other areas were being combed. His tendency to linger near the foundation long after most had moved on. His eyes, steady but unreadable, when Max pulled toward that direction. She had written it off as coincidence. Everyone had. He was the one offering comfort. After all, no one wanted to attach suspicion to the man who seemed to embody compassion. But suspicion had a way of growing roots, especially in Grace's mind, and now that the shoe had surfaced, the roots were breaking through the ground. She turned the car key, the engine rumbling awake, and drove toward Birch Street where Dorothy Wallace lived. Dorothy had been a neighbor of the Bennetts for decades, a sharp-eyed widow who spent most of her days at her kitchen window with a newspaper and a cup of coffee. Back then she had given her statement, saying she had seen the twins playing in the yard, then later had noticed the gate open, nothing more. Her words had been neat, precise, like a woman afraid of getting them wrong. Grace remembered the way she had folded her hands tightly together as she spoke. Tonight Dorothy opened the door in a heavy cardigan, her hair white and pulled back, her frame smaller but her gaze still clear. She invited Grace in without hesitation, as though she had been expecting her. They sat at the table, a pot of tea steaming between them. Grace asked gentle questions at first, about the weather, about Dorothy's health, easing into the conversation the way she had learned over 30 years of law enforcement. Finally, she asked if Dorothy had remembered anything new about the night the girls disappeared. Dorothy stared at her tea for a long time before speaking. "Time does strange things to memory," she said quietly. "Sometimes details hide from you until one day they don't." Grace leaned forward, her pulse quickening. Dorothy's eyes lifted, sharp now, and she said she had often seen Reverend Turner near the old church foundation. Not just once, not just during the search, but many times over the years. Late at night, when the rest of the street was dark, she would notice his flashlight moving among the stones. She thought he was keeping an eye on the property, making sure kids weren't causing trouble. But she realized later, especially after the twins vanished, that his visits didn't stop. Even years after, even when the church grounds were long abandoned, he kept coming. Grace's throat tightened. She asked Dorothy why she had never said this before. Dorothy hesitated, her voice low, as she admitted that Reverend Turner was respected, almost untouchable in the eyes of the town. She had convinced herself it was nothing, had buried it the way the town buried its grief. But now, with Grace standing in her kitchen, and the case stirring again, the memory returned with clarity. Grace felt the air grow heavy. The Reverend had been the anchor, the comforter, the one everyone trusted. And yet this testimony painted him in shadow. She didn't want to believe it. She wanted to cling to the man with kind eyes who prayed over grieving mothers. But she had learned long ago that evil often wore familiar faces. Max stirred at her feet, his ears twitching, his gaze locked on Dorothy as though he too understood the shift in the air. Grace nodded slowly, her voice calm but firm, as she asked Dorothy to write down everything she could remember, every detail, no matter how small. The widow agreed, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for a pen. Outside the window, snow began to fall again, thick flakes drifting into the dark, and Grace felt the pull of the past tightening around her. Reverend Turner, the man who had been first to comfort, now stood as the figure she could no longer ignore. The snow was still falling when Grace Miller returned to the church ruins, a dull gray sky pressing down on the frozen town. She had not slept, her mind circling like a hawk around Dorothy Wallace's testimony. Reverend Paul Turner had been the first to comfort, the first to offer guidance, and yet he was also the one seen creeping back to this very place, night after night. Grace walked the perimeter with Max pulling at the leash, his body tense, ears high, the snow crunching beneath her boots. Behind her, the crime scene van idled, releasing a team of technicians who carried tripods, ground scanners, and heavy flashlights. Sheriff Tom Bradley had arrived reluctantly, his breath rising in clouds as he spoke low to her, reminding her that the town didn't need another scandal. Grace didn't answer. She only looked at him once, long enough for him to see the conviction in her eyes, and then turned toward the crumbling foundation. Max pawed at the ground near a low wall, his nose pressed hard to the snow. The technicians cleared debris, their gloved hands scraping aside frozen leaves, until the sound of wood echoed beneath the metal end of a shovel. Grace knelt quickly, brushing away the last of the frost to reveal a wooden panel fitted neatly into the earth. The wood wasn't old, wasn't weather-eaten the way it should have been after decades of snow and ice. Its hinges caught the light with a faint metallic sheen, fresh, maintained. Someone had made sure this remained usable. Bradley muttered, his disbelief cracking into something closer to dread. The panel creaked as it was pried open, a gasp of warm air rising to meet them. Grace felt her stomach tighten. The scent was not dust and mold. It was lived-in air, tinged with cooking oil, soap, and the faint sweetness of laundry powder. Max's ears shot forward, his nose quivering, his body trembling with restrained energy. He knew what lay below. Grace gripped her flashlight, its beam cutting into the dark stairwell. The stone steps descended in a tight spiral, their edges worn smooth by decades of use, and she forced herself to breathe steady as she led the way down. The silence swallowed each footfall, broken only by the scuff of boots and Max's claws clicking against stone. At the bottom, the stairwell opened into a wide chamber that made Grace stop short. The room was not ruin, it was a home. Shelves lined with books, both children's stories and thick religious texts, stood against the walls. A couch sagged beneath the weight of years but had been mended and cleaned. A small television sat in the corner, connected to an extension cord that snaked up through the stone. The floor was swept, the insulation fitted carefully along the walls. This was not abandonment, this was maintenance. Bradley stood beside her, his voice low. Someone's been living down here. Grace barely heard him. Her eyes had already moved to the far end of the chamber where two small beds stood side by side. Handmade quilts, faded but neatly folded, covered the mattresses. Stuffed animals sat at the pillows, their fur worn from use. On the wall above the beds hung crayon drawings, stick figures of smiling girls holding hands under blue skies, with names written in shaky letters. Lily, Laura. Grace's knees nearly gave beneath her. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing over one of the quilts. The stitching loose in places but lovingly patched. The toys scattered at the foot of the beds were clean, not dusty. This was recent. She turned and found a low desk against the opposite wall, two chairs pulled close together. Open notebooks lay across it, filled with uneven handwriting, numbers and simple sentences. Crayons spilled from a tin jar. On the wall above the desk, taped pages fluttered in the draft, more drawings, more names. The twins had been here. Grace swallowed hard against the tightness in her throat. She lifted one notebook carefully, her gloves brushing the childish scrawl. The date written at the top was recent, no more than a few months old. Her pulse pounded in her ears. These weren't artifacts from 4 years ago. This place had been lived in until recently. Bradley cursed under his breath, rubbing a hand over his mustache as he looked around. This isn't just a hideout, he said. This was planned, designed. Grace moved to the shelves, her flashlight beam tracing over rows of books. Fairy tales sat beside scripture, alphabet posters pinned beside verses. A strange mixture of innocence and control, nurture twisted with doctrine. Her stomach turned as she realized what it meant. Someone had raised them here, taught them here, fed them lies wrapped in comfort. This was not just captivity. This was education in isolation. Max growled low, his body tense, his nose pressed toward a narrow passageway at the edge of the chamber. Grace followed, her beam catching the rough arch of stone leading deeper underground. She ducked inside and emerged into a smaller room. The air here was warmer, heavy with the scent of stale food and human presence. A small kitchen stood against one wall, a hot plate on the counter, shelves lined with canned goods and jars. Dishes were stacked neatly, the cups small enough for children's hands. Beside the kitchen sat another desk, its surface scattered with worksheets and chalkboard erasers. The wall above was covered in math tables and handwriting practice sheets, taped carefully in rows. Grace felt her breath leave her in a long, shaking exhale. It wasn't just a home. It was a school. This underground world had been constructed with purpose, with detail, with years of attention. Whoever built it had not just hidden the twins. They had created an entire alternate life for them. Grace pressed her hand against the stone wall, grounding herself as the weight of the discovery pressed down. The missing girls hadn't vanished into thin air. They had been here, beneath the feet of a town that stopped searching. Grace Miller stood still in the underground chamber, the silence pressing against her ears until she could hear the thud of her own pulse. The room smelled faintly of chalk, paper, and something sweeter like crayons warmed by small hands. Her flashlight beam swept across the desks again, the child-sized chairs pulled neatly into place, as if the lesson had only ended moments before. She crouched, her knees aching against the stone floor, and reached for the small notebook with the worn edges. She turned the cover with gloved fingers, her breath tightening when she saw the handwriting inside. The letters were uneven, looping too large in some places, almost hesitant, but they spoke louder than anything she had found so far. Papa Paul says Mommy died in the flood. He says we are safe here until God tells us it's time to go out. Grace froze, staring at the words until they blurred. She flipped to another page. Papa Paul says people outside are dangerous. They want to take us away. He says only here we can be happy. Grace closed her eyes, the air thick in her lungs. Every word was like a blade carving into her chest. For years she had imagined the Bennett twins longing for their mother, clinging to her memory like a lifeline. Now she saw how deliberate lies had cut that bond to pieces. These children were not crying in the dark for their family. They had been taught their family no longer existed. Beth Bennett's voice rose in her memory, the way she had clutched Grace's hand and whispered, "My girls know I would never leave them. They know I'm waiting." Grace had nodded then, had believed it too. Now the truth lay scrawled in a child's crooked handwriting. They thought she was gone. They thought she had abandoned them. Her throat burned as she flipped another page. This one was filled with a drawing in blue crayon, waves towering over a small boat. Inside the boat were two little girls, their names written carefully above their heads. Lily and Laura. Beside them stood a tall figure with a beard and kind eyes, labeled in bold letters, Papa Paul. Grace's hand shook. She pulled her light toward the wall above the desk and saw more drawings pinned in uneven rows. Some were faded, curling at the edges, others newer. Their colors still bright. Always two girls. Always the same man. Sometimes he was holding their hands. Sometimes he was steering a boat through a storm. Sometimes he was standing beside them in a windowless room. And always, written above him in shaky strokes, Papa Paul. Grace swallowed hard, her chest constricting. Reverend Paul Turner had not just hidden the girls. He had rebuilt their world with himself at the center. He had erased their mother, erased the town, erased everything beyond these walls, and replaced it with a story where he was savior, protector, father. Grace reached for another notebook on the desk, smaller, the cover decorated with stickers of stars. Inside, the entries were shorter, but no less devastating. Papa Paul read us a story about Noah's Ark. He says the world above is like the flood. If we leave, the flood will take us. Papa Paul says Mommy is happy in heaven. We should not cry. We are chosen to stay here. Grace's eyes stung. She pressed her lips together, her hand trembling as she closed the book. Each sentence was another thread severing the bond between the girls and the life they had been stolen from. She felt fury rise beneath her grief, a fury that tightened her jaw and made her fists clench. Turner had not just taken them. He had convinced them they were safe in his captivity, had dressed it in stories and scripture, until they no longer knew the difference between prison and protection. Behind her, Sheriff Bradley's boots scuffed against the floor as he stepped into the room. His voice was low, ragged with disbelief. "Grace, you need to see this." She followed him into the smaller chamber beyond. The walls there were covered in layer upon layer of drawings, so many that they overlapped. Stick figures holding hands, smiling beneath skies of crayon blue. Two girls standing beside a tall man, sometimes with angel wings, sometimes with a shepherd's staff. Grace stepped closer, her light illuminating the words written above again and again. Papa Paul. Papa Paul. Papa Paul. It wasn't just a name. It was devotion carved in crayon, worship painted in the language of children. Grace's chest tightened, her heart pounding in her ears. She wanted to tear the drawings down, to shred the lies from the walls, but her training held her hand back. Each paper was evidence, each drawing a testimony of 4 stolen years. Max pressed against her leg, his ears back, his nose twitching, as though he too understood the wrongness that filled the air. Grace lowered her hand to his head, grounding herself in the feel of his fur beneath her palm. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "They think he's their father." Bradley's face hardened, his jaw set. "And they think their mother's gone." The words hung between them, heavy, almost unbearable. Grace turned back to the drawings, to the little boat bobbing in crayon waves, to the smiles on faces that should have been laughing under open skies, not confined to a lie. She felt her throat close around a truth too heavy to speak. Somewhere above them, Beth was still living on hope, still waiting. Down here, her daughters had been taught to bury her in memory. Grace exhaled slowly, her voice steady but trembling at the edges. Even if we find them, they may not want to come home. Grace Miller's flashlight swept across the chamber, her breath catching when the light revealed a wall layered with papers. It was not cluttered, it was systematic. Newspapers pinned in neat rows, photographs of the Bennett twins at 5 years old, maps with red markings, handwritten notes in precise, almost reverent script. Grace felt her pulse slow into a heavy thud. This was not a mere hiding place. It was an archive, a testament to years of surveillance and control. She moved closer, the cold stone walls closing in, and let her gloved fingers graze a clipping from the Mill Creek Gazette dated 3 years earlier. Christmas Candlelight Vigil for Missing Twins. The headline was underlined in blue ink. In the margin, Reverend Paul Turner had written, "Community losing faith, need to reinforce narrative." Grace's throat tightened. He had not just stolen the girls. He had manipulated how the entire town processed their grief. Another clipping described a search near Mill Creek River. He had scrawled, "Divers, ineffective, safe." She reached for a more recent article, one that mentioned her by name. "Detective Miller refuses to abandon Bennett case." Her name was circled, and beside it, the words, "Dangerous persistence, monitor closely." Her chest constricted. He had not only watched the investigation, he had watched her. Every stubborn decision, every refusal to move on, had been catalogued. Sheriff Bradley stood beside her, his jaw clenched, eyes scanning the wall. "He's been playing us, Grace. Every move we made he already knew. That's how he stayed ahead." Grace felt anger rising, hot and sharp against the cold air. "No," she said, voice low. "He was not just playing us. He was preparing for us. He expected us to come eventually. That's why this wall exists. It is not just about control. It is about reassurance, proof that he's smarter than the system." Max let out a low growl, pacing at her side. His nose angled toward a desk in the corner. Grace approached, pulling open a drawer. Inside were maps of Mill Creek County, all marked with red pins. Some were clustered near abandoned farms, others near wooded hollows. One mark stood out farther north, near Miller's Quarry. Next to it was a single phrase, "Site B ready." Grace's hands trembled. "He has another location." Bradley pulled the map closer, his brow furrowed. "How long do you think he's been planning this?" Grace exhaled slowly. "Years. He never expected to keep them here forever. He knew discovery was inevitable, so he built a fallback." She flipped through another folder. Receipts for lumber, water purification tablets, medical supplies. All purchased over 4 years, carefully spaced out, spread across different towns. But the handwriting in the margins betrayed him. Small notes like, "Ventilation improved. Lesson schedule uninterrupted. Move winter coats before frost." She dropped the papers onto the desk, her chest heavy. Turner had not only kidnapped Hannah and Emily Bennett, he had raised them according to his own twisted design. Bradley's radio crackled. A deputy's voice, cutting through the tense silence. "Sheriff, perimeter check, complete. No sign of Reverend Turner. Tracks in the snow heading east. Multiple sets, 2 smaller ones and 1 adult. Fresh." Grace bolted for the narrow stairway, heart pounding. The icy morning air hit her face as she emerged above ground. The yard was still except for the scuffed snow, where their own team had gathered. But near the tree line she spotted it, prints leading away, crisp at the edges, not yet softened by wind. She crouched, brushing snow aside. 2 sets small enough to be children. One heavier, deliberate, a man's stride. Max whined, tugging against the leash, nostrils flaring as he strained toward the forest beyond. Grace's breath came shallow. "He was just here," she whispered, "minutes ahead of us." Bradley knelt beside her, his hand pressed to his thigh as he studied the trail. He moved them as soon as he sensed the net closing in. He's been preparing for this moment for years. Grace rose slowly, eyes locked on the shadowed line of trees. The prints faded into white silence, vanishing into the deeper woods. The snow was falling lightly now, each flake a reminder that the trail would not last. He knew, Grace murmured. Every step we took, he anticipated. He was not just hiding the girls. He was hiding his next move. Max barked sharply, the sound echoing off the abandoned church ruins. Grace's chest clenched with both fury and despair. She could almost see Turner in her mind, his calm, steady voice, his air of authority, his twisted belief that what he was doing was salvation rather than imprisonment. He would lead the girls without fear because to them, he was not a captor. He was Papa Paul. She turned to Bradley, eyes fierce. He's ahead of us. Again. But this time, we have proof. We know who he is, what he's been doing, and where he might go. He's running out of places to hide. Bradley's expression was grim, his breath a cloud in the winter air. Grace, this is not just about finding him anymore. This is about getting to those girls before he convinces them the outside world is the enemy. Grace looked down at the fresh tracks one more time, snow beginning to blur their outlines, and felt the urgency settle into her bones. Turner had slipped through their fingers again, but this time he was not vanishing into mystery. He was vanishing with intent, moving the twins toward a sanctuary he had been building in secret. And every second they hesitated, he would be pulling them deeper into his delusion. The pursuit began before dawn, when the first light of morning painted the snow a pale blue and every sound seemed sharpened by the cold. Grace Miller sat in the passenger seat of Bradley's patrol truck, her gloved hands tight around the map they had pulled from Turner's underground chamber. The red circle around Miller's quarry stood out like a wound, but the trail had already begun hours earlier. They had followed the footprints into the woods until the snow swallowed them, then widened the search with patrol units combing every back road that stretched away from town. It was not long before the radio crackled with a report that sent adrenaline spiking through Grace's veins. "Sheriff, we've located Turner's vehicle. Old Ford pickup, abandoned near Route 17 just outside the county line. Doors unlocked. No driver." Bradley exchanged a look with Grace, his face grim. He pressed the radio. "Any sign of the girls?" A pause, then the deputy's voice came back. "Yes, sir. Children's coats in the cab. 2 juice boxes still half full. Seats in the back have impressions. They were here recently." Grace shut her eyes for a second, drawing in a slow breath that stung her lungs. He was not just running, he was moving them deliberately, step by step, like pieces in the game he had been playing for years. Bradley's truck roared to life, tires spitting gravel as they turned off the main road toward the quarry. The closer they drew, the more Max grew restless in the back seat, pacing and whining, his nose pressed against the crack in the window. Grace reached back to steady him, her palm against the thick fur of his neck, and whispered, "Easy, boy. We're getting close." When they arrived at the site of the abandoned truck, the scene was unsettling in its quietness. The Ford sat skewed on the shoulder, one door hanging open as though its owner had walked away in no hurry. Grace climbed out and approached slowly, every detail etching itself into her mind. The inside of the cab smelled faintly of crayons and apple juice, scents that did not belong to Turner but to the girls. A small mitten lay on the floorboard, bright against the faded vinyl. Grace crouched, picking it up carefully, and sealed it in an evidence bag, her chest tightening. "They were here, within the last few hours," she murmured. Bradley joined her, scanning the tree line that stretched away toward darker hills. "He's on foot now, which means he's close." Max tugged against his lead, nose sweeping the ground in rapid arcs. He pulled them toward the roadside ditch, where the snow was pressed flat by recent passage. Grace followed, her pulse quickening, as the dog led them toward a faint trail heading north. She glanced at the map again, the red circle at Miller's quarry, now more than just a possibility. "He's going there," she said. "He's planned this for too long. That quarry isn't just a landmark, it's his endgame." Bradley grimaced, but he did not argue. The convoy moved quickly, sirens off, engines muted against the frozen air. The quarry rose ahead of them like a scar in the landscape, its limestone walls jagged and pale against the winter sky. Grace felt her stomach drop as memory stirred. She remembered Turner attending town picnics there years ago, leading prayers at community gatherings when the quarry was still a local landmark. He had history here, roots that ran deeper than anyone had realized. Now those roots had twisted into something far darker. Max lunged forward as they reached the perimeter, barking sharply. His nose pressed against a pile of disturbed snow near the quarry entrance. Grace knelt beside him, brushing it aside to reveal crumbs of granola bar and a child's drawing on notebook paper, folded but damp at the edges. She unfolded it carefully, the crayon lines smeared but still clear. Two girls holding hands beside a figure labeled, Papa. Grace's throat constricted. They were alive. And they were here. Bradley's radio crackled again. "Sheriff, we've got signs of recent campfire inside one of the quarry's lower caves. Still warm." Grace's eyes narrowed. Turner was not improvising. He had built this place into his plan long before they had ever come close to him. Every move was deliberate. She looked back at Max, who stood tense, his gaze locked on the dark maw of the quarry caves ahead. His growl rumbled low, not of uncertainty but of recognition. Grace rose, her hand on the leash, and whispered, "He's in there, isn't he, boy?" Max's bark echoed off the stone walls in answer. Grace and Bradley exchanged a look, the weight of 4 years pressing down on both of them. The quarry was not just another hiding place. It was Turner's final sanctuary, the last chapter of a twisted narrative he had been writing with the lives of 2 innocent girls. The cave swallowed sound, turning every step into a hollow echo. Grace Miller moved slowly behind Max, her flashlight cutting narrow beams across the limestone walls that glistened with condensation. The air was damp, warmer than the biting wind outside, and it carried faint traces of smoke and something else, something human. She kept her breath steady, one hand close to her holstered weapon, but her heart pounded hard enough to make her ribs ache. Sheriff Bradley and 2 deputies followed at a careful distance, their lights sweeping into pockets of shadow where jagged stone jutted out like broken teeth. Max moved with certainty, his nose low, his body taut with concentration. When he paused, Grace froze. She followed his gaze ahead, where a soft glow flickered like candlelight. She lowered her beam, signaling Bradley to wait. The voices reached her before the sight did. A hymn, carried in 3 tones. The deep voice of a man, and the lighter harmonies of 2 children. The words were indistinct, but the melody was old, one Grace remembered from her own childhood. Her stomach twisted. They were here. When she finally stepped into the chamber, she saw them. 2 girls, now older, perhaps 9, their blonde hair braided neatly, their small bodies dressed in handmade blue dresses. They sat cross-legged on either side of Reverend Paul Turner, who knelt before a makeshift altar of stacked stones. Dozens of candles lined the chamber, their flames throwing shadows that danced against the rock walls, making the place resemble a chapel carved out of the earth itself. Grace's chest tightened. After 4 years, here they were. Alive, healthy, and completely changed. The girls' faces were calm, not fearful. Their eyes solemn with a gravity no child should carry. Turner's voice was low and steady as he finished the hymn. Then he turned and met Grace's gaze without surprise. "Detective Miller," he said, almost warmly. "I wondered when you would find us. Your dog is remarkable." Grace's throat went dry, but she steadied herself. Her flashlight beam shifted, catching the outlines of the children. Hannah and Emily Bennett, no longer 5-year-olds but not yet 10, sat quietly, their eyes fixed on her. Grace whispered their names, her voice breaking. "Hannah, Emily." The girls looked at her, heads tilted slightly, their expressions curious but unrecognizing. Emily spoke first, her tone clear and polite. "Are you from the Floodlands? Papa says people from the Floodlands are dangerous." Grace felt her heart splinter. They did not remember her, their own mother. To them, Turner was truth. Turner was safety. The man who had stolen them had remade himself into their savior. "Girls," Turner said gently, his hand resting on Emily's shoulder. "This woman is not who she claims to be. She comes from outside, from a world that is broken. You are safe here with me." Grace's vision blurred with tears, but she fought to keep her voice calm. "Your mother has been searching for you every single day. She never stopped loving you." The girls glanced at each other, then back to Turner, whose reassuring nod silenced any spark of doubt. Grace felt helplessness clawing at her chest. Years of conditioning had cemented his lies into their hearts. It was then that Max stepped forward. His paws made no sound on the limestone floor as he moved slowly, carefully, toward the twins. His ears were forward, his body low, the steady patience of a dog who knew this moment mattered. Grace did not restrain him. She knew instinctively he was their best chance. Hannah blinked when Max approached, her hand rising almost automatically. The dog stopped inches from her, lowering his head, waiting. Her fingers touched his fur, tentative at first, then more certain. Emily followed, reaching for the scar on his ear. Her lips parted. "I remember you," she whispered. Grace's chest tightened. The child's words hung in the damp air like a fragile thread. Hannah's brow furrowed, her hand stroking Max's neck. "You were there in the snow," she said slowly, her voice uncertain but insistent. "It was cold, and you were warm. I remember." Turner's calm mask flickered, a shadow crossing his face. "Children," he said quickly, "memories can deceive. Dreams feel real, but they are illusions." But Hannah did not pull her hand away. Emily leaned closer to Max, burying her face in his fur, her voice muffled. "He was ours before, wasn't he? Before the flood?" Grace's tears spilled. Silent, but relentless. She dared to hope, dared to breathe, as she saw recognition flickering behind their eyes. Years of lies could not erase the bond of a dog who had once been their protector. Max stood steady, a living bridge between their past and the present, his amber eyes meeting Grace's as though to say, "This is the way back." The candles flickered violently in a draft, and for the first time, Turner shifted, his composure strained. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and he knew it. The chamber seemed to shrink as silence pressed down on everyone. Hannah and Emily still knelt close to Max, their small hands buried in his fur, the fragile thread of recognition trembling between them and their past. Grace Miller stayed low, her palms open, her voice steady though her heart felt like it might burst. "It's all right, girls. You're not alone. Your mother has been waiting for you." Reverend Paul Turner's face was pale, his lips dry, sweat glistening at his temple. His body swayed slightly, and Grace recognized the signs she had seen in diabetics before: the shallow breathing, the unfocused eyes, the trembling hands. Yet even in his weakness, his voice carried conviction. "Do not listen to her," he said, his tone both pleading and commanding. "I am the one who kept you safe. I am the one who taught you truth. Out there is chaos and corruption. Here is salvation." He clutched the edge of the stone altar for balance, his knuckles white, his breath ragged, but his eyes burned with fervor. Hannah looked at him with a mixture of fear and longing, while Emily clung tighter to Max as though afraid he might disappear. Sheriff Bradley's shadow appeared at the chamber entrance, deputies behind him, their flashlights bouncing across the stone. Turner saw them, and his desperation grew. "See? Girls? They come to take you away. They will lie, they will tell you the flood never happened, but it did. The world drowned in sin, and I saved you." His voice cracked, but his conviction did not falter. "I saved you." Grace's throat ached. She had seen men broken by grief before, but never a delusion this deep. His granddaughter's death had twisted him, driven him to build a false ark underground, to steal children and remake them as survivors of his imagined apocalypse. Yet standing there, trembling and sick, he believed with all his soul that he was their redeemer. Grace's voice softened. "Paul, look at them. They're not safe. They're confused. You've told them a story that kept them small. But they deserve to live in the real world, with their mother, with their family." Turner's eyes widened with pain. His hand pressed to his chest as his body sagged. But still he shook his head violently. "Family? Their mother abandoned them. She left them in the cold. I was the one who brought them in, who gave them warmth, food, love." He pointed a trembling finger at Grace. "You want to rip them from everything they know. I will not let you." The girls flinched at his tone. Emily whispered, "Papa, you don't look well." Hannah's brow furrowed, her voice uncertain. "Why are they saying Mama is alive? You told us." She stopped, glancing between him and Grace. The room filled with tension so sharp it felt like the air itself might snap. Grace stayed utterly still, knowing the choice was not hers to force. It had to come from them. Max stepped closer, pressing his head against Emily's chest, then nudging Hannah's arm. The dog's calm presence cut through the chaos of voices and fear. Hannah's breathing quickened as a memory seemed to flicker back. Snowflakes, a warm body pressed against her in the cold, laughter from a world that did not fit Turner's story. She whispered, almost to herself. I remember her voice too. And the smell of pancakes on Christmas morning. Turner's face collapsed. Anguish and fury, mixing, as he staggered. No, Hannah, that was a dream. I gave you life. I gave you meaning. He coughed violently, his body shaking as he sank against the altar. Grace took a step forward but did not rush, her eyes never leaving the twins. Emily reached for Hannah's hand, her grip tight. Her gaze moved from Turner to Grace and back again. If Mama is real, she whispered, why did you say she died? Turner's lips trembled, his answer halting. Because she failed you. Because I could not let you be hurt again. The truth cracked his voice, the delusion fraying under the weight of their questions. Grace's tears streamed freely now. Girls, your mother never stopped looking. She never gave up on you. And Max never forgot you. That's why we're here. The chamber held its breath as Hannah and Emily looked at each other, then at Turner, who was crumpling, his body weak but his eyes still begging. Stay, he rasped. Stay with me. I am your salvation. Then they looked at Max, who leaned into them with steady warmth. His presence undeniable, his memory undeniable. Emily spoke first, voice trembling but clear. I want to go with him. I want to go with Max. Hannah hesitated, torn, her lips quivering. Turner's hand lifted toward her, shaking. Please, child. Hannah blinked, her tears finally falling. She turned to Grace. Where's Mama? Grace's breath caught. At the station. Waiting for you. Ready to hold you again. That was enough. Hannah gripped Emily's hand tighter, and together they stepped away from Turner, their small bodies leaning against Max for courage. The sound Turner made was not anger but a broken wail, the cry of a man who realized too late that his salvation was built on lies. He collapsed fully against the altar, the sickness finally overtaking him. Deputies rushed forward, securing him gently but firmly, while Grace moved to the twins, lowering herself until her eyes were level with theirs. You're safe now, she whispered. You've always been loved. Max sat between them, his amber eyes calm, his body still, a sentinel who had carried their memories back to life. As they walked out of the cave into the pale winter light, Grace felt the weight of years lift slightly from her chest. Turner's twisted story had ended, but the true story of healing and reunion was only beginning. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Which moment struck you the most, the girls touching Max? Or the moment they finally chose to step away from Turner? Share your thoughts below, and let us know where you're watching from.